So we now come to Birgitta Jonsdottir. Birgitta is a bullshit detector of an entirely different kind. She's a volunteer shit disturber, actually. Is that okay if I say that? She was linked with Julian Assange and the Wikileaks organization during its fabulous sort of formative explosive phase. Now somewhat disconnected, but it's true as a residue of all of that she is apparently being investigated by American prosecutors. Birgitta is actually a member of parliament in Iceland and is marshalling legislation that she hopes is going to make of Iceland a leaks haven for journalists and media outlets. So, Birgitta, come out and tell us about the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative.
Oh, well, thank you. Hi, I'm very humbled and pleased to be here. Today is Iceland's National Day. Marks 200th anniversary of our national hero, Jonsdottir. And I chose to spend it with you, and I have certainly not been disappointed. This has been such an inspiration, both to listen to the people and talk to so many of you that I've had the privilege to get to know. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about democracy, freedom of information, and why I support Wikileaks. It all started with my activism ever since I can remember. I have always had to speak out, stand up, and raise my voice if I see injustice, ever since I was 14. I have never been a part of any political organization or religious organization. I practice my own Birgittaism with a dash of Buddhism and heathenism. I have never been competitive, but I have always been very passionate about what I believe in. And I really think it is so important to believe that you can do anything. And that's what I've done. I just basically jump into the deep end of the pool and I see if I sink or swim. And I'm still alive. So many of you might have heard that Iceland had the third largest financial collapse in the history of humankind. We always have to do things big because we're so few. We're only 318,000, so it's quite rare to see an Icelander in person. However, it might be interesting for you to know that there are more Icelanders in Canada than there are in Iceland. They're mostly all in Manitoba. And we identify ourselves very much with Canada. So we always think very much about Canada, and we deeply respect you for not caving into deregulations in the banking sector, because we had to learn the difficult way. But within a crisis, there was a massive collapse in Iceland. It was so huge that it was not only about money, it was about us learning about us the hard way. So we realized that not only did the financial sector fail us, everything failed us. Everything that was supposed to warn us failed us. The academia, the politicians, the media, just everything failed us. And one of the reasons it failed us was because we didn't have any encouragement for people to blow the whistle. We didn't have strong enough source protection. And we didn't have independent enough media, because it was either owned by the banksters or it was controlled by politicians. Through the state, TV gets all the money from the government, so obviously they're always a bit biased towards the government. So we had to go on sort of an inner reflection on what went wrong and what can we do to fix it. Before that, we had a bit of a revolution and we overthrew the government and kicked out the central bank guy, and he actually was a prime minister before he became the central bank manager. And let's just think about time. Do you know how long it took us for making the banks grow 12 times the GDP? It only took us 3 years because of deregulations and nepotism and stuff like that. So, one of the things we had after the revolution was, or around the times of the revolution, we had all these people wanting to participate in the society. And I think that's very beautiful. And I think that's one of the things that actually brought me into Parliament. I think it is so important that you, me, everybody that wants to, should have the tools to help co-create the society. Because if we don't help co-create our society, we will never live in the society we dream of living in. So it is so important that everybody, and I encourage all of you, to pressure for national referendums as an option in your country, for example. We've done that in Iceland, and it sure feels good to have something to say about your own destiny. Anyway, so I'm helped create a political movement 8 weeks prior to election. It's horizontal, doesn't define itself left or right. We are only focusing on the agenda, and we have to dissolve within 8 years. If we can't accomplish what we are set to do, we also have to dissolve. And 2 weeks prior to election, I decided to lead my constituency, and to my great shock, I was all of a sudden in Parliament. And what a challenge, but what a privilege, because I haven't been an activist for a long time. I protested for 9 months outside every week I organized protest outside the Chinese embassy for Tibet prior to our collapse. And to have a voice inside, I've been knocking on the doors of the politicians for so long, and to just be able to corner them off, what a privilege. So I feel humbled, and I feel this is an incredible opportunity to plant seeds, and to be able to change things from within as well. So those of us that want to see change for the benefit of our planet, which, by the way, we're sort of running out of if we don't stop being so heavily focused on consuming. We also have that responsibility of trying to apply changes, have the revolution, which is, in fact, if you take the R off, it's an evolution. The word is sort of the same. And it means changes and pushing the boundaries of what's normal. So I got into Parliament, and shortly after I got into Parliament, there was a leak in Iceland. It was one of the loan big books of the big banks. And for the first time in our history, we experienced that the state TV was put under prior restraint, that they could not publish the news about the leak that they had prepared. And I remember the anchor, I was watching the news, this is the main news. We only have like 2 TV stations, and one of them is the state TV, and everybody watches the news at 7, or most. So the anchor comes on and he says, we have been gagged. We can't tell you the story about this leak, but we can tell you where we found it. So they put the picture of Wikileaks webpage on, and the URL, and say you can go and look for yourself. And that immediately brought our attention to Wikileaks. This was in August 2009. So we probably heard of them a bit earlier than the rest of the world. And I was asked to speak at a conference because I'm the only geek in Parliament. I come from the background of being one of the pioneers on the internet in Iceland, the first woman that really started to work in web development and so forth. Plus I am a poet, primarily a poet, and a writer. And so I was asked to speak at a conference for Digital Freedom Society, and there Julian Assange and Daniel then Smith, now Damset Berg, were speaking about an idea that completely fascinated me. And there was a guy a year earlier that had been speaking at the same conference, and his name is John Perry Barlow, and he's the founder of the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So he was speaking about this idea of Switzerland of bits, where you would take the tax haven model. Like if I want to start a tax haven tomorrow, what I would do is I would look around the world and find all the best laws to create secrecy. So what he suggested is that we would look for all the best laws in order to create transparency. But this was sort of a year too early. So next year, Julian and Daniel were talking about the similar idea, and they had the experience, and this is so important about Wikileaks, and very many people, at least in the United States, I don't know how it's here in Canada, have an incredible misconception about what Wikileaks is. Wikileaks is not a group of hackers that hack in and steal information. They're a media outlet that actually promises that and they sort of act like the middleman for the digital brown envelope. So somebody drops the brown envelope digitally, and we can't know, or they couldn't know at the time, who was dropping the envelope. But they could open it and check if this was indeed original documents or not. And then once they opened it, just like any media outlet, if it is important and should belong in the public domain, they published it to the public either directly or later on with other medias. And this is a very important element to have, because we are living in times of both incredible self-censorship with the media, and they are so weak because they are metamorphing into the internet and other medias that are not the traditional format, and they haven't figured out a way to make money. And so they're shaving off investigative journalism sections because they're expensive and they don't create a lot of clicks. And they are also under constant threats by international law firms that specialize in pulling out stories about their own, for the corporations they represent. So most of the news we see is not really the news because it's been stopped before we get a chance to see it. And that's why it's important to have an element like Wikileaks, because they have managed to show us that they have figured out ways, legal ways, to keep the stuff up no matter what. No matter who goes after them, they have managed to keep the stuff up for us, to have access to information that should belong in the public domain. And I thought that it would be brilliant to create that legal framework in the offline world in Iceland as a part of our resurrection. So we would sort of look out, we went on a sort of a scouting mission to look for all the best laws for freedom of information, expression, and speech that are actually functioning. And many of you that might know where strong laws for freedom of information might not be surprised that most of these laws you will find in Sweden. Because they've even put into their constitution very important elements about freedom of information and the right for the access of information, particularly from the public sector. Anyway, so we start to work on this. I actually asked the Wikileaks guys and some other Icelandic people at the conference. I sort of being a very impulsive person, I say, okay, let's just do this. And so we did. And somehow, I don't know, I still don't know what happened. I managed to push it through the parliament, this proposal changing between 10 and 13 laws in 4 ministries, and I come from the smallest party, and it's like course defining on where we're heading as a nation, and I got an ocean of green. Everybody in the parliament said yes, even the government. So we are actually creating strong freedom of information, strong legislation for whistleblowers, source protection, limiting prior restraint, history protection, and so forth. And we should have this entire shield up, or at least 80% of it, within a year. And this is probably, for me, the most important work I have ever done politically, because it's setting a standard in Europe, and it is it created attention and desire for other nations to use this as a model. How beautiful is that? Like 2 years ago, thank you. Like 2 years ago, and I want to say this as an inspiration for you, 2.5 years ago, I was temporarily unemployed. But I knew that I, as an individual, I can change the world, just like every one of you. If you just go and do something, follow your heart, be passionate, because that's passionate and humbleness is the greatest tools for achieving something. And I have seen that so much here during this event and with the people I've spoken to, because I think very many of you that are sitting here should actually be here on this stage. So that's really wonderful. And finally, because I know many of you are interested in Wikileaks, why did I help Wikileaks? Well, I come from an activist background, and in Iceland we're so few that we sort of have to import activists. We actually was a part of a mission to do that, SOS call for Saving Iceland, 2005. So I was one of the people fighting against the Iraqi war. I created an event called Poets Against the War, Artists Against the War. I helped organize the big protests, outdoor protests. And I was so disappointed that we stopped fighting this when the war started. And then I see this video in a cafe, downtown Reykjavik. Probably one of the first people in the world to see this. And I felt, I have to do something. I have to do everything I can to make sure that as many people can see this video as possible. And that's what I did. So I helped co-produce it. I put my name on the list, my neck on the... but this is one of the things that I am also the most proud to have been part of. And I think it's important, and I just want to leave you with the thought that, like, prior to Wikileaks, very few of us were talking about freedom of information, status of information in our countries, and like the cornerstones for a democracy, that's freedom of information, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. If we don't have that, we don't truly live in a democracy. So that's something we have to really keep strong and look after. And that's why I helped Wikileaks, because I felt and I knew that they would bring on the agenda freedom of information in the debates. I don't know how many conferences I've been to speak about it. I've been in more documentaries than I can count. So, yeah, I just think it is so important that we stand up and protect the internet, because the internet is the nerve system, it is the collective consciousness. And once they put barriers on the internet, they're putting barriers and blocks on this incredible flow we're experiencing for the first time in our humanity. So thank you very much for listening to me, and please talk to me if you have any questions. Thank you.